This is Dialogue. Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
And this is Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist Mae Brussell. I'm Phil Kogan, and we welcome you to another edition of Dialogue Assassination. Mae, of course, the major story, one of the major stories of the week has been the death of J. Edgar Hoover. And, of course, newspapers around the country and around the world, radio stations, TV networks have all reported the death of Hoover. And nobody until now has mentioned...
Do you dare say it, Phil?
A conspiracy.
To kill J. Edgar Hoover? Should we try that one today? We're going to throw it out
So that's what you're going to try today, right?
Well, we're going to do... This is called the obituary for J. Edgar Hoover. We're going to do a program on J. Edgar Hoover because we've talked dialogue assassination for almost a year, Phil, and everything that we've mentioned on each of the programs can be related back either to the Central Intelligence Agency or the FBI. Almost every aspect of material that I bring in has to do with agents of the FBI like Lee Harvey Oswald or the Central Intelligence Agency. And Hoover is very important in the political assassinations. So I think we'll talk about J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover had a love affair in his life. I'm finished reading a book by Hank Messick called John Edgar Hoover. And Hank Messick is the man who's written many books on the syndicate and crime. And this book is the relationship of Hoover to organized crime. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the one person that he had a love affair for, according to Messick, was Shirley Temple. And I loved Shirley Temple when she was little, so I want you to know that Hoover can't be all bad. He may be mad for the next 59 minutes of this show, but for 1 minute, he can't be all bad if he likes Shirley Temple. That's the one thing we had in common, J. Edgar Hoover and I, was we liked Shirley Temple. And outside of that, we'll get right on to the subject of J. Edgar Hoover with the usual format that we have, Phil. I'll take the news of this week as it came out, and we'll go relate it back to his death and his contributions to this country. Again,
that's sort of the format of Dialogue Assassination. Each week you relate the news to political assassinations and the assassinations of Kennedy, the two Kennedys, and Martin Luther King, and tie it together as to maybe establish a pattern that keeps reoccurring.
When you talk about assassinations, Phil, you have to remember that in order to gain power, and we're talking power of the world or the mineral and the oil and the resources, I refer to them as the goodies of the world, every person that stands in the way of the power is expendable, even members of the team. And we're going into that, how maybe Hoover died a natural death and maybe he had a little help. He was certainly expendable at this moment in history.
Well, he was also old. I mean, he was sort of...
He was 76.
It was about ready for him to die.
Well, there was enough coming out about him to give him a heart attack. But I'm wondering how much of that was put out to put him down at this particular moment in history where Richard Helms stays high and mighty. Nothing is written about the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm going into that, too. The FBI is going to get a new director temporarily, Richard Nixon said this week. And he's appointed Assistant Attorney General Patrick Gray, who will be the new director until after the elections. Now, the media is very conscious of the fact that the elections could be affected by a new controversy. Richard Nixon knows that, and the newspaper people asked him, if you lose the election, would you appoint the new director in the interim between the new president? And Richard Nixon was caught off guard, and he said, we're not thinking in those terms, quite frankly. So they pressed him further that if he lost the balloting, would he attempt to fill the FBI post? And he committed himself and said that he wouldn't. And this is pinning him down. People are getting smart. Even the carefully screened newsman in the White House got this question out and pinned him down. It's very important that the man who's taking temporary head of this particular agency is from a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, because the chain of command in the political assassinations comes from Navy intelligence, from CIA to Defense Intelligence Agency through Navy intelligence. And Richard Nixon was part of this Navy intelligence group, and almost every appointment he makes has to do with Navy intelligence. So the man who is getting the post temporarily in, he's a friend of Nixon's for the last 10 or 12 years. He'll be the temporary director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but save your biographies on him and follow it through. Now, before J. Edgar Hoover died, on last Saturday's program, I talked about the War Council. Remember? For people who listened last year, the War Council was Richard Nixon flying into Texas to be with John Connally. Nixon goes around a lot of places now, and he has a lot on his mind. But he took his helicopter from Randolph Air Force Base to San Antonio and visited John Connally for those 25 electoral votes in Texas. I have said that since 1963, November 22nd, this is a one-party system. You know, Richard Nixon didn't take a motorcade through Texas for those electoral votes. You notice that. He took a helicopter. He didn't, when they told Lyndon Johnson, when Lyndon Johnson told Kennedy, you have to come down in Texas. This was in May or June, El Paso Hotel with Clifton Carter and his other aides. They said, you have to come down in Texas in the fall. They pressured him. This is the way for the Democrats to get Texas. They waived those electoral votes, and the decision was made that early summer that he would be in Texas in the fall. But now we have John Connally, the Democrat, offering the 25 electoral votes to Nixon, the Republican. No motorcade. He doesn't have to do the kind of campaigning that John Kennedy had to do to get those electoral votes. And notice how the party lines are crossing over. You know, they're entertaining with this big barbecue. But I called it the War Council, that meeting, and I refer once again, for some of you who've never heard my shows, to a book by Penn Jones called Forgive My Grief. Penn Jones has written 3 books on the assassination. This is from Volume 3 of Forgive My Grief, in which he said on November the 21st, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, the assassination of Kennedy was more important than the Normandy invasion, and a conference was held for the Dallas Project. I'm reading this part of the book because J. Edgar Hoover attended that party. This one he wasn't invited to. He was about to decease from this earth. But at this War Council meeting in the garden of Clint Murchison, at the home of Clint Murchison, there was a conference of Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover, where all the major forces of this country were involved and had to be accounted for. Killing the president was the most important takeover of a country in world history. I'm reading Penn Jones' book. A party was held there. J. Edgar Hoover, task force commander, conferred with his troops and issued the last-minute instructions to review the final plans and give the world to go or to cancel as necessary. Now, in the obituary of J. Edgar Hoover, I'm going to mention this quotation from Penn Jones' book, and there's 4 more books we'll talk about on this show that just came out. One just came out. One is at the publishers. One has been out about 2 months. To show you where J. Edgar Hoover was in American history, what was coming down on him at this moment, and why his staying on this earth, either what he did would give him a heart attack or he was no longer useful to the Richard Nixon campaign. And I'll tell you how that group Nixon's group were in on the killing of DM and on the killing of Joe McCarthy. And they come down on the people that they use when they can't use them any longer. There's a book out besides Penn Jones' book on Forgive My Grief. There's a book out that I talked on our radio show about 2 weeks ago called The Texas Mafia. It's at the printers now, and this book, the discussion of it in the newspaper said this book blisters the Texas tycoons from Lyndon Johnson to Clint Murchison, that's the very wealthy oil man that J. Edgar Hoover was associated with all the time at Corona Del Mar on the racetracks, and had many, many deals and close associations with Clint Murchison. The book ties the White House occupant, which is Richard Nixon, and all of their under-table deals with J. Edgar Hoover. That's called the Texas Mafia. Forgive My Grief. It has the story of the conference of Nixon, Murchison, Hoover. The night before Kennedy was killed, the Texas Mafia has Lyndon Johnson, Murchison, Nixon, and Hoover. Hank Messick, the book I just referred to, and I'll read parts of it on the program as much as we have time. I want to cover a certain order here first, is a new book by Hank Messick called John Edgar Hoover. Now, Hank Messick has studied organized crime. I've read several of his books, and I've ordered some more. He has written The Silent Syndicate, Syndicate in the Sun, Syndicate Wife, Syndicate Abroad, Secret File, and Lansky. He has written a book called John Edgar Hoover, showing the continued relationship of crime and business and politics, of the syndicated crime, the racetrack people, organized crime, to J. Edgar Hoover, starting with Meyer Lansky, who was put into Navy intelligence again. That goes back to Navy intelligence. And
book published just this year?
It just came out about a month ago by David McKay Company, New York. It just came out. And
fortunate timing for the author and publisher.
Yeah, on the back cover of the book it says, for a half-century, John Edgar Hoover, unique among Americans, had the power to destroy the infamous syndicates of organized crime, and he failed to use it. Instead, as crime grew in the nation's biggest business, Hoover used his power to enhance his reputation and that of the FBI. Sworn to defend the country, he was unable to distinguish its true enemies. Posing as a moral leader, he helped create a generation of cynics. Under the guise of fighting subversion, he encouraged those on the right who distrusted democracy. Perhaps his greatest disservice has been to confuse the American people about the real nature of organized crime. Instead of admitting it was an economic problem, he said it was a moral issue and assured the public it did not pay. It did handsomely and largely because of him. That's from John Edgar Hoover. Now, another book...
Is that to implicate him as an accomplice to organized crime?
Oh, absolutely. He worked hand in glove with organized crime. Hoover,
what did he get out of it?
Hoover had tremendous power. You see, he helped men in the distilling business like Lou Rosenstiel, and during the time of the Prohibition, Lou Rosenstiel has a J. Edgar Hoover Foundation and museum, and they have publicity, and speakers acclaiming the glories of J. Edgar Hoover. He got into the early bootleg at the time of the Prohibition thing. What he got out of it was the orderly succession of power. And this book also goes into, we'll bring in another assassination someday, because there's a man on the peninsula who knows about it. And I have his name on the arsenic poisoning of President Harding. And that was the beginning of Hoover's career. And the man who wanted to tell who killed Harding was put in jail by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover worked his way up from the early days, in 1924, on deaths and scandals and locking up the people who would tell the truth. And this book goes into the fact of how Harding died of, in quote, acute indigestion, and there was no autopsy performed. And Hoover put a man in jail who wanted to tell the story of the Harding murder, and had him locked up. Hoover worked his way up by hiding people that should have been exposed. It's an interesting book, and it says over the decades, he built a secret organization subject to his whim or will. One of the things Hoover did, he was a very religious person as a child, and always was, and went to church, and he did not sign up in World War I when Woodrow Wilson asked all the young patriots to go to war. He didn't go to war, but he had something like a scout uniform, and he'd wear it to church services. He went into the Justice Department when everyone else was going off to war as a young man and got a deferment, didn't have to go in the service. He stayed patriotic from inside the early Justice Department, and he worked his way up. It's a very good book on how he worked his way into power and what he got out of it. He got tremendous prestige, and because he was very religious, and the communist revolution threw out God as well as the Tsar, that was his natural enemy. He took an antagonism to communism very early, so that he could create a love for Nazis as against communists, and it was all tied in with his theology. I'm sure that his goal was to always go after the communists. So the organized crime and Nazis and other kinds of people, extreme right-wing, were no problem to J. Edgar Hoover. They weren't a threat. And he had a thing to fall back on, because if you criticized him, he said you were a communist. you couldn't find fault with him because he had this wonderful cover story. Like Dr. Spock made the remark when he passed away this week, it's about time. So the media said only the radicals are criticizing him. Nobody else would do it. Only the communists or the leftists would ever take a dig at Jake, because you have to be a left of center to criticize him. Well, these books are his record. This is where it's at. These aren't all written by left of center by a long shot, and his record will begin to pour out. Now, this book, Lansky, is another book by Hank Messick, and it ties in J. Edgar Hoover and the syndicate and organized crime, but it's different than the one on that Messick wrote on just Hoover, because he throws in Bieber Rebozo, Richard Nixon, Smathers of Florida, and Lyndon Johnson as being all of the same team. This is a very heavy book, and this is what I've been trying to say is happening all along, that these men have a very close relationship that needs to be examined. There's a new book coming out, which I don't have yet, by Peter Noyes, called Did the Mafia Kill JFK? And this is about syndicated crime, J. Edgar Hoover, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. Now, you see, how much are Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon going to take of this? You see, J. Edgar Hoover is being discredited down the line. And he's old, and he's an embarrassment because he should have retired, but Lyndon Johnson wouldn't let him when he was 70. And he's an embarrassment to Nixon.
What do you mean he wouldn't let him when he was 70?
Well, you turn in...
The story that got out was that Hoover didn't want to be resigned.
Well, what you do, you turn in your resignation because the law reads, or the civil service, that you resign. And Johnson said, no, I can't let you. You're the most valuable man in the country. He wouldn't accept the resignation. That's why he wouldn't let him. He may have gone through the formality, you see. He wanted to live until his great monument, that FBI building, was dedicated in his honor. And they could give him the accolades that they did Lyndon Johnson at that library that we talked about last week. There's some talk that he was going to be buried in that FBI building. I think it would be fitting that he should be, but they probably won't do that. I didn't read the paper where the final decision was made. But this book by Peter Noyes has to do with Mafia, Hoover, Johnson, and Nixon. And you have to keep in mind that all these books are bringing in Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon wants to be president in 1972. He wants to be elected. And Richard Nixon has risen up over the ashes and bones of a lot of people. We've talked about the political assassinations, and I feel that his responsibility should be exposed in his lifetime. But he's running for election, and everything's timed in election year. And as these books pour out on J. Edgar Hoover, they have to be an embarrassment. Now, this week, the article came out on Jack Anderson in many of the papers on the briefing of Lyndon Johnson of the sex habits of various people.
Right, that story came out just the day before Hoover died.
The day before Hoover died, and the day that Hoover died, there were more in the paper the day before it came out, and then the following day, the papers were filled with it. And the L.A. Times had a front page story on the 3rd, May the 3rd, said, Johnson's bedtime reading. Anderson assails the FBI secret love memos. Well, for those of you who follow Dialogue Assassination regularly, I have always emphasized different aspects of the political assassinations, and one show I did when Gloria was still here was on the sex habits of various public officials and how the Washington hierarchy uses them to gain votes or electoral votes, not electoral votes, congressional votes, and to affect the minds of various members of Congress. And Bobby Baker was notorious with this, with his purple suites. He had girls dressed in purple, and I heard the stories who have articles, purple carpeting and rugs, and ran whorehouses. And Lyndon Johnson would entice these particular public officials into these various whorehouses that Bobby Baker ran. This was the story. And then Bobby Baker was the Secretary of Congress, and he'd hand out how people were to vote on certain situations. We've talked about Howard Hughes, the greatest voyeur of them all, who had a wall in Las Vegas with 40 cameras on it. And he had a switch button, and he could see within every 2 inches of Vegas. And you could set up all kinds of conventions and things and get public officials there and junkets or meetings, and they could be photographed or documents kept in all these compromising positions. The sex habits of public officials has been one of the ways that J. Edgar Hoover has decided to effect votes in Congress to get what he wanted, appropriations, to keep people from being active in civil rights positions, taking certain stands. And when I completed my 8 years research on the John Kennedy murder and was ready to sit down and write the outline I have for 5 books, the head man above all the research, more important than where the bullets and rifle were purchased, was a man named Frank Capel. And Frank Capel is a writer. He is in Army intelligence. He's written up in the Warren Report on volume 15, page 718, 19, 723, page 725. Frank Capel wrote a little book called The Strange Death of Marilyn Monroe. And it has he implies that Robert Kennedy had a part in murdering her, but Frank Capel and J. Edgar Hoover loved to watch the Kennedys. And it wasn't hard because they were hopping from bed to bed like there was no tomorrow, and they could control Robert Kennedy. You see, he was the Attorney General. And it was my feeling, based upon all the evidence I had of J. Edgar Hoover's watching them through Army intelligence and through his agents, that when John Kennedy was killed, Robert Kennedy was blackmailed to not do anything. You see, in the Justice Department, you had Robert Kennedy as the head of the Justice Department, and under him was J. Edgar Hoover. Supposedly, the FBI is under the head of the Justice Department. But by having the goods and blackmailing Robert Kennedy for so many things, and there was this terrible hatred because Hoover and Robert Kennedy just hated each other. They didn't talk to each other at all. I felt that one of the reasons that Robert Kennedy never went into the actual evidence of who killed his brother was the heavy blackmail that Frank Capel and J. Edgar Hoover had on him that kept the truth from being told. Because his own personal life, his family, his reputation, his desire to be president someday were blocking the truth, where his obligation was to the country as the head of the Justice Department. And this book by Frank Capel goes into the fact that he wanted to be president someday, and that his relationships with these women, that Frank Capel could keep, he kept the information of his relationships with them, particularly Marilyn Monroe and her death, the circumstances of her death. We did one show on that, but I wanted to show that when the Anderson story broke on the voyeurism of Lyndon Johnson, who at night went to bed with these reports, these sex reports on various people who had no arrest records at all. These men had a hang-up on sex that was unbelievable. And I have one file on single men involved in the assassination. That doesn't mean that men who are single have to be involved in political assassinations or espionage or intrigue. But the major figures in the political assassinations were single. The men who were involved, these bachelor types like Hughes and J. Edgar Hoover and David Ferry, Jack Ruby, General Walker. There's a whole team of men, it goes to about 30 men, that are single, that Clay Shaw.
What's the significance of being single?
Well, there's a book Wilhelm Reich wrote on the origins of fascism, and it's 300 or 400 pages. And the theory goes into, he's talking about German fascism. He came from Germany and left when the Nazis came. And his feeling was that the lack of sexual compatibility or orgasm is diverted into legalized hostility in the form of repressions. The people that hurt enough will join uncivilized political parties and do terrible acts as a means of expressing themselves. Wilhelm Reich is a well-known psychiatrist, and the origins of fascism is just into that subject. So when I talk about a fascist takeover in this country, and I look at the people who are named and their voyeur habits, and they're really strange. I'm just mentioning a few, but there's a whole lot of them I have at home, that I pick up, and they fit into this classification that Wilhelm Reich was talking about. Now, these people that were watched by J. Edgar Hoover with their sex life, they had no police record at all. There was no file on them. The LA Times had an article. I have 3 articles here from the news this week. A love affair, no matter how sordid, is no business of the FBI, the LA Times was saying, and so was Jack Anderson. Yet the FBI demonstrated their intense interest in who was sleeping with whom in Washington. And President Johnson was one White House occupant who had a fine appreciation for stories about the extracurricular lives of public figures. Hoover happily prepared secret memos loaded with intimate details about personal affairs of the high and mighty, and that was President's bedtime reading. You he had reports we know on Martin Luther King, but he kept them on Marlon Brando, Harry Belafonte, Joe Namath, David Abernathy, and these were signed reports by J. Edgar Hoover, and there was no security involved. They were not by the White House. There was no reason to follow these people, except that this was their particular little hang-up, to watch the sex lives and love affairs of the prominent. So Hoover had a delight, and he named Lyndon Johnson. Now, Johnson isn't funny. When I talked about the War Council last week, Lyndon Johnson isn't to be messed around with, and neither is Richard Nixon. And I don't think they like a cover story that says Johnson's bedtime reading. Richard Nixon was not interested in these little stories. Nixon's a different classification. These little earthy stories about bed hopping are not Richard Nixon's cup of tea. There's a fine line that we can go into. Well, we discussed J. Edgar Hoover, that I talked about before, and that was when Howard Hughes moved into Las Vegas. I did a lot of one show on that subject, that I felt that in this country, which had become a police state but needed to tighten its controls, that Howard Hughes moved in there to squeeze out the FBI and the Mafia, and that there would be a friction in the next 4 years between the Mafia, the Syndicate, and J. Edgar Hoover, which I described in what they're thinking is like a counterculture, ethnic groups, Italians, Jews, the low-level robbers with their skimming money. And Howard Hughes, who owns 1/50th of our country, one state, and has the largest defense contracts, I guess, of any person in this country, is closer tied in with the heads of government than any one single man, working with the moon and the submarines under the seas. Howard Hughes, with Intertel, which is International Police Force, and Interpol, would come into Vegas and begin to tighten up the control on J. Edgar Hoover. At the time he moved in, I didn't know that Robert Mayhew of the FBI was running the gaming tables at Las Vegas. But Mayhew has been crying, he wants his job back, and everybody's hurting at Vegas, and they're not having any fun anymore. The international police are watching what's happening, and things are tightening up. This is part of the tightening process. And I predicted that Richard Helms, who is the chief grand master of this clandestine system, a lot of people are never familiar with his name. You don't read much. He's the head of your Central Intelligence Agency. He was brought up in very fine academies, not like J. Edgar Hoover. He went to Europe. He's met Adolf Hitler. He worked with John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles in the OSS. It became the CIA. He worked with Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's head of Eastern European Development and Intelligence, who formed our CIA. Helms was a protege of Allen Dulles. There's no civilian head of the CIA. Richard Helms is that man. And to me, he epitomizes everything like Howard Hughes, with his Mormon aides, his 5 men dressed in white, and everything sterile and clean. Hughes and Nixon and Helms epitomized to me the systematic, robot, fascist, all-business kind of person. They're not voyeurs in the other sense. They're dangerous. They're more dangerous. And the equivalent, and we'll go to this on the second half, the equivalent of Richard Helms coming down on J. Edgar Hoover is like Richard Nixon coming down on Joe McCarthy. McCarthy was useful to Nixon, but he was an embarrassment. And he had to crush McCarthy and be in charge of his defeat, because McCarthy was sort of an earthy big mouth who talked a lot, and he was an uncoordinated fascist. And I'm going to read part of an article or description of Nixon and McCarthy by Emile D'Antonio. He was an earthy, uncoherent, he had no party. Nixon has a party, and it's lined up with the German cartels, John Connally, the people down in Jamaica, the headquarters. And it's time. This is why, Phil, I say it was time, if Hoover didn't die a natural death because of all the exposés coming out about him, then he had help coming along. But the exposés aren't coincidental either, because when you want to expose the CIA, you just don't do it. There was an article in the paper this week about Mr. Marchetti. He worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He's a free citizen of the United States. He wrote one book called The Rope Dancer, and he wanted to write a book about the Central Intelligence Agency. But when you want to do that, it goes to the judge at Alexandria, Virginia, where the Central Intelligence Agency is. And Judge Albert Bryan, Jr. declined a protest from the American Civil Liberties Union that no other nation's history has ever done. No other judge in the nation's history has restrained the publication of fiction. This is a book by Victor Marchetti on the Central Intelligence Agency, written in the form of fiction, and the book will not be allowed to be published. His earlier novel, The Rope Dancer, came out, and it was written up in Ramparts and Computer and Automation. Marchetti is the man who claims that the Central Intelligence Agency in South Vietnam killed 17,000 civilians in order to make Mr. Thieu look like the candidate of their choice. Not army people, but politicians, news people, ordinary citizens that did not like the regime, just like people do not like the regime in Athens. And Marchetti claims that the assassination squads from the Central Intelligence Agency killed 17,000 civilians in South Vietnam.
Okay, we'll pick up more about J. Edgar Hoover and his friends after we identify the station you're listening to. This is KLRB FM Carmel, on the air 24 hours a day.
Phil, for those who just turned on in the half-hour break, this is Mae Brussell, KLRB in Carmel, talking about dialogue assassination. We're doing a little obituary, a few comments on J. Edgar Hoover in memory of his departure, and pointing out some of the things that are not put into the newspaper that you read.
Right, the program is Dialogue Assassination, which deals with political assassinations and the news of the day as it relates to what Mae says is the general scheme of things. I would pick up now where you were talking about this book about the CIA, which won't be published.
Yeah, what I wanted to say was that I have many books on the intelligence system, like the espionage establishment, White Tie and Dagger, and so forth, but none of these books are against Richard Helms or the Central Intelligence Agency or the way he got his power. If you read the books carefully, there's enough to make your hair stand on end about the Central Intelligence Agency, particularly the last 3 books that came out the first of the year on Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi general.
Now, this book, you say this is the first time in the history of any nation in the world that a book has been suppressed by a judge, before it's been published? First time in the United States?
Yes.
The judges actually forbid publication?
Yeah, a federal district judge, I'll read this to you from the newspaper. A lot of people wonder why I make such broad assertions or statements, and I do like to read articles or from the book because I'm not making it up. A federal judge, district judge, refused Friday to relax a temporary restraining order to let a former Central Intelligence Agency agent circulate a novel about the CIA to publishing houses, despite protests from the American Civil Liberties Union lawyer that no other judge in this nation's history has restrained publication of fiction. Judge Albert Bryan declined to modify the restraining order. They argued that Marchetti might disclose thinly disguised secrets under the guise of fiction. The government was to have presented witnesses to support its claim that the publication of a nonfiction book could cause grave and irreparable injustice and injury to the United States.
That's another book that Marchetti's writing.
Well, this is the one they're stopping from coming out. You see, now the case has been reset until May the 15th. I think the government tried to stop the Pentagon Papers and got a court proceeding to halt those until they decided about the who would be injured by the publication. And the people that are injured by the publication of the Pentagon Papers are the men who lie and double deal, give public speeches, and proclaim a certain policy for the United States that they are telling you about their position as each day rolls along, and they are actual downright liars. Jack Anderson went before a congressional committee this week and said Richard Nixon is a liar. Now that's as strong a language as I've heard said by somebody before the congressional committee. He said he lied. He was talking about the Freedom of Information Act, and Anderson accused Nixon personally of lying to congressional leaders about the India-Pakistan policy, and he said the administration, in quotes, lies through its teeth over such matters. as the whereabouts of Foreign Affairs Advisor Henry Kissinger. And Anderson asked in an appearance before the House Government Information Subcommittee currently reviewing the working of the Freedom of Information Law. He talked about what he said was the unjustified secrecy surrounding foreign policy and defense. And he feels that these things should be open and the government should not be run in secret. And this is what I tell people about the National Archives locking up the proof of who killed John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King or 200 or 300 other people whose names I have. This is all done in secret. Now, when the judge says in Alexandria, Virginia, that this information may do grave damage to the United States, that's only his opinion, because people should know what's going on at the Central Intelligence Agency. This man blew his cover. He worked there for many years as a very fine agent, and he feels the American people have to know. This is why he's writing a book. And there was a story written up, I think, the February issue of Computer and Automation about Marchetti, Victor Marchetti. So the federal government has laws and judges to stop you from seeing what is available. I talked to a gentleman on the phone last night, and he didn't understand my tax case against the government based upon the secrets that are locked up that would prove how Johnson became president or Richard Nixon became president. And he said, well, Johnson's succession to the throne was an orderly procession, and while people talk about conspiracy, there has never been proof yet of the conspiracy. And I explained that the proof is marked top secret and can't be seen for 75 years, and they don't have the right to lock that up from us. I will say he has the right to be president after I see the evidence. Now, getting back to the obituary of J. Edgar Hoover was one of the most shocking articles this week that came out of the newspapers. It was in the San Jose Mercury and the Monterey Herald. No other paper that I have has it so far. I take 8 a day. The title of the article says, "Almost Everything Goes at the Auction of Jack Ruby." And the gist of the article is this: in a town called Athens, Texas, the furnishings of Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who shot Lee Harvey Oswald in jail when he was handcuffed 2 days after the killing of President John Kennedy, the belongings of Jack Ruby were sent to a man in Athens, Texas by the name of Mr. Ware. And he runs an auction parlor. His name is L.J. Ware, and he's a partner in the Athens Transfer and Storage Company, and they ran an auction. And I'm going to read to you from the newspaper what happened at the auction.
Who sent these goods?
Now, the belongings of Jack Ruby were furniture, which he says was very fancy things. It was none of this cheap stuff. He said his furnishings came from Boston, New Hampshire, and those kind of places. But among the things auctioned in Athens, Texas, was a safe, which served as Ruby's office safe at the Carousel Club. And it was sent to Athens, Texas, where it was, in quote, stolen this last weekend, Friday morning or Thursday night, and Ware said he did not know what was in the safe. He said he made an agreement. Now listen to this, Phil. Mr. Ware made an agreement never to try to open the safe before it was sold at the auction. And
made an agreement with who?
Well, that's what I want to know. I cross-filed this article into 11 different subjects for my filing system, and I'll show you. That is one of the questions. Who does Mr. Ware of an Athens transfer company make an agreement with never to open the belongings of Jack Ruby?
Who sent the belongings to Ware?
That's another person. I have that listed here under witnesses not called before the Warren Commission. J. Edgar Hoover, as head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Dallas police collected the belongings of people involved in the political assassination. Now, Ruby, you can't take lightly, because if he didn't kill President Kennedy, he killed the man who said, "I didn't do it." He killed the man who said, "I'm a patsy." While he was alive for 2 days, Oswald said, "I didn't do it." Locked up in the National Archives for 75 years are all the papers on Jack Ruby. I have a list of what's in the National Archives, and through this Freedom of Information Act, we should be able to see what's locked there for 75 years. I have a copy of a letter that I've read on a different show from a lawyer working for the Warren Commission to another lawyer, and it was dated 1 week before the Warren report went to press. And he said, on the chapter under conspiracy with Jack Ruby, we can't say that there was no conspiracy involving Jack Ruby and the people related to the assassination because we haven't gone into that matter. All we can say in the wording of the Warren Report that as far as we have researched and examined, there was no conspiracy. So by their own admission, we have now the fact that everything that belonged to Ruby is top secret, 75 years, locked up in the archives. And what was in his personal safe, these were his business working papers, who he knew, who he saw, who he wrote letters to, was sealed up 9 years, sealed 9 years, and delivered on a truck to Athens, Texas. When I read the article, I wondered, who is in Athens, Texas? I've never heard of the town. Ruby came from Illinois, and it's certainly a far-out place, not in Dallas, to auction it. He lived in Dallas many years. Why in Athens, Texas? But when you read the book on Hank Messick, on J. Edgar Hoover, he refers to the town, on page 145, he refers to this town where Sid Richardson, the oil billionaire, and Clint Murchison lived. That was their home in Athens, Texas. I think they own the whole town, and I know that a very important woman in that town, Sylvia Odio, who had information of the political assassination, who was an important witness before the Warren Commission, when her testimony got too hot, and after the assassination, she was housed in the home of a man whose father works for Clint Murchison. Sylvia Odio was picked up right away and stayed in this particular domicile. But his things went to Athens, Texas, where boyhood friends Clint Murchison and Sid Richardson grew up. Richardson passed away, and I forget the figure. John Connolly was the attorney for that estate that came into millions and millions of dollars, just being the executor of Sid Richardson's estate. John Connolly got that windfall. So Jack Ruby's safe was removed. Now, Ware said he made an agreement never to open the safe before it was sold. And the question, we have to repeat it, because I go too fast sometimes, is who does this transfer man make an agreement with, and how did he get it? If J. Edgar Hoover is running the investigative agency of this country, how did this man get it? Now, what happened to the safe? He says the safe was worth $250, not counting the value of what would be inside. And he also said that he was going to offer $300 reward for its return. The safe itself is worth the amount of $250 to $300. He offered a $300 reward, but what happened to the safe? It was stolen. So you know how many times I've talked about evidence missing, evidence locked up, Phil, on the political assassination?
Quite a few times.
Okay.
A lot of things, a lot of holes and a lot of theories.
Well, don't you think it's a little bit shocking to keep coming across this kind of handling of evidence on the murder of President John Kennedy?
Yeah, the question also is obvious. How, after 9 years, could there be evidence which hasn't been examined
by the
relating to the assassination, especially by a man who's killed the alleged assassin?
That's right. I mean, it becomes, I cross-file this, I have, a lot of subject categories that I put this under. I put under coincidence, because the town of Athens is the home of the men, Mr. Murchison. We talked about the relationship of Hoover, Murchison, Nixon, Lyndon Johnson. The safe ended up in Athens, Texas, where it was stolen. Right after the political assassination of John Kennedy, a wealthy oil man in Colorado wanted to buy the rifle of Lee Harvey Oswald. And that could be very disposed and never seen again. That was stopped, and I think it's still in Washington somewhere. Its capability could be duplicated. We could shoot it and see if it could get that many bullets out in a certain time period if the investigation opened again. And to dump that rifle was terrible, but you see, people are sleeping. The nation is sleeping and is not aware of what's happening. So the safe made a trip, and it's gone now from the face of the earth. Now, talk about sleeping, I have to plug a movie in town that's playing at the Golden Bough, The Garden of Fisi Contini. It was made by Vittorio De Sico, and it's the story of a family in Italy, very well-off, very wealthy Jewish family, who opened up their garden to the Jews who couldn't go to the tennis courts anymore in Italy when fascism took over and the Nazis and Mussolini combined. And they had acres of a beautiful garden, and it's the story how generous they were to the Jews, the children who would knock on the gate and they could play tennis and use their grounds. And they were totally undisturbed until a knock comes on the door and the Fisi Contini and the whole family go off to the concentration camps to be murdered, just like the people in town, that they thought if we keep quiet and don't say anything, all we have to do is stay home in our room. The son stayed home in his room because he felt as an outcast in town, and the Jews, they cut them off first. They couldn't have hired help, and they couldn't go to the schools, the public schools. They couldn't use the school libraries, and every time a new order came down, they didn't take it seriously because they thought if we obey this one, we'll come out okay. They'll just leave us alone. We won't need their schools. We'll educate ourselves, and we don't need their tennis courts. And they went along with everything until it was their time, and they went too. And I have to say it's playing now at the Golden Bough, and these movies come along very seldom, and the people in Carmel do not make a lot of money off these movies. These small theaters that show like Sacco Vanzetti and this one at the Golden Bough, I think you people should encourage them. Everyone complains about Vietnam and taxes and the warfare state, and they can't see themselves caught into the system. And it's a well-made movie. It won the award for the best foreign film this year. It's well-made, and it's pertinent into your complacency about, this is 9 years after the murder of John Kennedy, and all of Ruby's safe that was never opened has gone. Now we're talking about J. Edgar Hoover today. Where were his men when this safe was taken from I was in Dallas, and Ruby's nightclub became the Carousel Club is the police headquarters for training young people. They do boxing and things there. The Dallas police took over his nightclub. Why didn't the safe go to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington?
Maybe it did.
Never opened. Never opened. The Warren Commission not only didn't use what was in Jack Ruby's safe in his personal files and contacts and telephone numbers, but they let it be stolen at this point, shipped out to Athens, Texas. I want to talk about James Earl Ray today. His hearing for a new trial was turned down, but we'll finish up a little bit on Richard Nixon when I talk about an article that was published this week by Emil D'Antonio. It was a beautiful article. Antonio was a young man who went to Harvard University and was in the service in the last war and got out, and he's made documentary movies. And he's a valuable person, like DeSico with his movie on the Garden. He did Point of Order, the McCarthy hearings, and he did Rush to Judgment, Mark Blaine's book. He did a photographic document, and he did The Year of the Pig on Vietnam, and he did Millhouse, the white comedy. And the article by Antonio is as close to anything that I've seen in print to the article that I'll have out in The Realist that comes out in June on how Richard Nixon came to power. It is the closest explanation of Richard Nixon that I have seen. And he goes into the fact that how Joe McCarthy was used and railroaded. And he made sort of a buffoon of himself, Antonio said. And there was a group there that decided to come down to McCarthy and get rid of him. And he used shots of McCarthy in the movie Millhouse purposely to show how hard McCarthy campaigned for Richard Nixon. But there came a time in Washington, in the White House, he said, where Richard Nixon and William Rogers, who's now Secretary of State, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was then U.S. Ambassador to the UN, and Clark Clifford, who was a Democrat. Now this group, William Rogers, Henry Cabot Lodge, Ambassador to the UN, Clark Clifford, are all mentioned in the Pentagon Papers and the killing of Diem and a secret deal. Lodge was the ambassador to Vietnam at the time. Clark Clifford is the attorney who worked with, he's Howard Hughes' attorney, and he worked with Lyndon Johnson. There was a close tie-in, but this particular group that is mentioned by Antonio, Rogers, Cabot Lodge, Clark Clifford, and Nixon, sat together, and they said, McCarthy is wrecking the army and the country. He's sort of making a fool of himself. And he says McCarthy was done in because he broke the rules of the game and the establishment. McCarthy was a fascist. He had fascist ideas. They accused him of being a drunkard. He had no group around him, no cliques or organization. He was power hungry and so forth. And all the fascist elements of the country were behind him, including President Kennedy's father and the Texas millionaires. But he was an embarrassment to the intelligence community. And he goes on to say Nixon is the most intelligent creature that has been produced in the 20th century. The way he was down and out in 1962 and pulled himself up. And he goes into how these men could come down on McCarthy if he was an embarrassment to their general plan of power and schemes. He said what he was able to do in the Alger Hiss case is a key to what Richard Nixon is all about. And he goes into the details of this. This article's in the current issue of the Free Press. The Odyssey has them if anybody wants to pick those up. He says this is the one case where Nixon was caught red-handed as an outright lie. Now, he's talking about the Alger Hiss case, and today Jack Anderson's talking about his outright lies in the Foreign Affairs Department of our country. And he said what he did to Alger Hiss was an outright lie. Whereas Nixon just said Alger Hiss, Nixon went after just Alger Hiss, and McCarthy went after the whole era. And he got Hiss sent to prison and himself to the White House. But J. Edgar Hoover helped Richard Nixon through all these years and got him into the power he was in. But I don't think it's beyond Richard Nixon or Richard Helms or any of the powers that be, Howard Hughes or any of them, if Mr. Hoover becomes an embarrassment because of all these scandals and books that are coming out, if they can keep the publishers from embarrassing them and let everything come down on Hoover, and they wouldn't think twice about bidding adieu. John Connally presented the flowers, Richard Nixon the ceremony, but the record stands for itself how Mr. Nixon acted way back in the early days and how he's performing today in the same manner. I think there's a consistency about Richard Nixon that people don't give him credit for.
And an obituary type review that I ran here on the station the day that Hoover died, we made reference to both seriously and through comedic interpretation about what J. Edgar Hoover might or might not have on various people to keep himself in power for as long as he did. Do you really think that John Edgar Hoover could have avoided using the mounds of information that he must surely have come in contact with?
Could he have avoided using
it?
No, this is why he accumulated them. You see, he accumulated it, and it was a double deal between each other. He accumulated this information to gain power, the power that he had.
Would you say that that's what kept him in power?
Well, you couldn't remove him from power. If the President of the United States, or Richard Helms, wants a particular agency to conduct the planning of the political assassinations, which was done through Mr. Hoover's racetrack friends in Montreal, Canada, and then came down to the various agents in the United States, if they could use him, they can't remove him. Now, I have a theory. You see, there was an article on the succession of the new FBI men in the paper this week, and they suggested Evel Younger or Sheriff Pitchess of Los Angeles. And I have hit on Evel Younger almost weekly on Dialogue Assassination. So this next week, I will get out letters to as many members of Congress as I think have any backbone to them at all. I did this when they were considering an appointment to the Supreme Court, and they mentioned the possibility of Ronald Reagan's attorney, or Mr. Compton, who worked with Evel Younger. And I sent out 100 personal letters to every member of the Senate that no appointment for the Supreme Court should come from this state until all the political assassinations are opened up for Texas. Now, to consider Evel Younger as the head of the Justice Department, or Sheriff Pitchess, is to avoid opening up in the Los Angeles Police Department. Younger and the LAPD have been involved in the assassination squads, the Robert Kennedy murder. Sheriff Pitchess's department and the Special Enforcement Bureau of the Sheriff Department take care of the Chicano group, and they were involved with the Sharon Tate massacre, the La Bianca massacre, the Isla Vista affair, and the killing of Ruben Salazar, plus many, many others. I'm mentioning the most prominent were killed. Sheriff Pitchess and Evel Younger know too much about how the system works, so they have to get power. See, I keep one filing cabinet thing on people directly involved in political assassinations who worked their way up to positions of power afterwards. Jack Valenti, who worked for Lyndon Johnson, became the motion picture czar. He had no relationship to movies, or I think the last picture you saw was the Last Picture Show down in Texas. You know, Valenti became the motion picture czar. Leon Jaworski from the CIA Foundation, that was involved with the Warren Commission and represented the state of Texas, became president of the American Bar Association. John Connally may become president of the United States because of what he knows in Dallas, because he publicly has said a different bullet hit me than has said Oswald. And he said it from the day of the assassination. And that's John Connolly's power. That's the source of his power. Because he knows that if two bullets, separate bullets, hit him and the president, then Oswald couldn't do it alone. So these men used their power to elevate their position. And they have to be promoted because they know so much. And this is why I fear any man taking over the Justice Department. They're mentioning certain people from the head of Narcotics Bureau. The Narcotics Bureau are terrible in terms of political assassinations. Next week I'll bring in, we've got to summarize now, so next week I'll bring in a tape. I listened to it last week, a tape recording played on KPFK in Los Angeles, and I typed it up to read to you on the show about the contact man from the Tobacco, Alcohol, and Firearms Division working with Larry Shears on the arrangement to bring Cleaver home in a box, dead, as well as the planning to kill Cesar Chavez. A promotion of someone from the Treasury Department to the Justice Department can't be done till all of these evidences of conspiracy or attempt to murder or the diabolical use of people on narcotics raps to kill civil rights leaders, blacks and Chicanos and so forth, is exposed. People listening to me, if you have an interest or social conscience at all, write to your public officials, on your congressman, on the succession of the next head of the FBI. Congress will approve this time. You know, there was a bill passed in '68 that the new head of the FBI has to have the approval of Congress, not just appointed, like the cabinet members now. So no matter who wins the election in November, keep in mind who shouldn't be the head of the FBI.
Is that it for today?
Well, I can talk about James Earl Wade. Do we have much time?
No.
That's
Why
it.
don't you just very briefly review the newsletter? How's that coming?
Well, the newsletter is coming really great. I wish we were ready to go to print. I work on it just like mad. I have all kinds of ideas, and I'm filling 28 different envelopes with columns. There'll be 28 columns.
Okay, so you're going to have this newsletter that'll be published every other week, and people can subscribe. And do you recall the address?
Yeah, 595 Broadway, in care of the Realist. And it's New York 10012. I'd prefer you send $8 a year, then you'd get the Realist 6 issues a year. And I'll have that article on Richard Nixon. I did another one. Paul's doing one on the Manson case, which fits in. Paul Krebs, the editor of Realist, which fits in with my talk about Manson on these shows. It's the part left out of the Manson book. And it's $8 for the Realist 6 times a year and the Conspiracy Newsletter 24. For $8, you'll get both publications.
Okay, that'll help you get a written account of what's going on.
Yeah, I have
and more things you can't, even in an hour on the air, you can't possibly transfer the written word to a radio program and get it all in.
No, we'll have
Impossible.
books suggested reading, current books and old books and things to look up, to document, do your own research and become part of wanting to know what's happening. Don't be like the family in Italy that sat there and just played tennis and sipped tea. Become involved in what's happening, because it's happening.